Today's session is called Pathways to Academic Support and Resources, Unleash Your Potential at Penn. So my goal is to make sure that you're aware of the Weingarten Center resources that are available to undergraduate, graduate, and professional students at Penn. So I'll talk through some of those, but then I'm going to also kind of dip into my area of expertise, which is around learning strategies. And so I'll talk a little bit about ways to sort of plan and prepare for your spring semester so that you can get the most out of it. Maybe thinking about if you encountered any challenges or difficulties, which is normal and expected in the fall semester. Maybe you'll hear something in this session that that you want to kind of adapt or adjust based on how that went in the spring. So again, Ryan Miller, Senior Director at the Weingarten Center. I'm a Penn GSE alum, so I graduated with my EDD in 2016, and have been at Penn for a long time, 12 years, and had the pleasure to work with a lot of students and a lot of international students over the years. So the first thing I'm going to just kind of pose is a question maybe to just reflect on a little bit. So because I think that if you're starting your maybe it's your second semester in your first year at Penn, or or you're further into your kind of Penn career, or you've been here for a little while, whatever it is, a new semester offers an opportunity to really reflect on what went well, what were the challenges for the prior semester, and how could you adapt things so that maybe you achieve a little bit more balance, a little bit more productivity, a little bit more enjoyment from your academic experience, which I think includes all the other components, the social components, the cultural components of being a Penn student. So I'd like you all to just kind of think for a minute, what was your biggest challenge from the previous semester? What challenges do you anticipate having in the spring? And so some of the things it would be, staying on top of, your planning, feeling like you have control of your schedule. Maybe you found that academic reading was really overwhelming, all the kind of assigned reading from the fall semester. Or maybe you had some really difficult exams, or this is a semester when you have some large writing assignments. So it could be a combination of these things. We know that being a student is a complex endeavor. So, really think about what challenges have you experienced? What do you think will be challenging about this semester? And that's where I also want you to think about what resources are available. So especially if this is your second semester, what I find is that students, when they first come to Penn, it's just overwhelming, right? You might have participated in Forerunner or, new student orientation, a lot of, maybe things that are specific to your program or school. And, in those last weeks of August, first few weeks of September, you heard about tons of resources. So like all these different places you can go to access. And then you kind of went through the semester and maybe you realize at this point, like, oh, actually, I didn't go check in with career services, or I'm wondering if Penn Libraries has a resource that could be helpful to me. Or, maybe I didn't use office hours as much with my professors. Maybe I was unsure of how to do that, or I felt kind of intimidated. So, I would say that I would really encourage you to think about, for the spring semester, setting a goal of accessing a resource that you haven't accessed before, because they're available to you. There's a kind of really a wealth of resources at Penn, but again, it can be kind of overwhelming to try to tackle all of them. So we also hope that the Weingarten Center is one of those resources if you haven't accessed our services before. And the Weingarten Center is Penn's home for academic support and disability services. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by academic support, and then I'll go into a little bit of the processes around accessing disability services. So the area that I support most directly is the work that our learning specialists do. And this is a unique resource. So I'm in contact with colleagues at peer institutions, other Ivy League schools, and I have to just be straightforward with you. The Penn has probably the largest, most robust kind of academic support team when it comes to learning consultations, or what other schools would call like academic coaching. And this can be a resource that's sort of unfamiliar to students, because maybe in your previous institution, maybe it was when you were an undergrad or in high school, you never worked with a learning specialist or an academic coach. So you're kind of unsure of what that resource is. but we have 7 staff members at the Weingarten Center who we call learning specialists. 2 of them are current doctoral students at GSE. The other 5 are full-time professional staff. And the main service they offer are individual learning consultations. So either virtually or in person, you can schedule a learning consultation with one of our specialists and talk about any of these topics. So maybe you want to talk about just general study strategies. Maybe, again, you're sort of feeling like some of the planning and time management was like a little bit weak or not developed or effective for you in the fall. Maybe you have some challenging exams or assignments that you're anticipating for the spring. Again, maybe just the reading load and sort of processing everything that your professors are putting forward in their courses is a challenge. Or maybe it's an issue around communication. So maybe you felt like you did all your homework, you were always prepared for class, but you didn't really participate that much during the fall semester in your courses. Or you didn't feel as confident presenting, what you've learned and your knowledge to your peers and to your faculty. So those are things that we can help with in learning consultations. The nice thing is that you can try different learning specialists, sort of see who is a good fit for you, and then you're welcome to, once you find a learning specialist that you like working with, you can meet with that person, on an ongoing basis. So you could schedule with them, a few times a semester or every few weeks. And I think that could be really helpful to just sort of create some structure and accountability as you're working to maybe develop some new skills and strategies that you think will help you in your academic performance in the spring. So people always ask me, when is the best time to see a learning specialist? Should I come in early? Should I wait until I have, a bigger assignment or an exam coming in? And really the answer, even though this looks like a little bit, specific, it's just any time. Essentially, we say whenever you'd like to adjust your habits and systems. So whenever you feel like you're ready to kind of rethink your strategies for your coursework or do some planning, we would encourage you to come in and meet with one of our learning specialists. So if students are coming in now, often we're talking about, again, what habits, routines, practices worked well in the fall. What do you hope to do in the spring? And what do you know so far about your courses? So we really want to look at maybe your syllabi, your the courses in Canvas, hear from you. What are the changes in your schedule? How do you think that will affect you? And talk about maybe specific strategies for each course. So maybe you feel like this course is pretty straightforward, but this one's more complicated. Maybe there's a group project, or maybe it's a type of writing assignment that I haven't seen before. So we're happy to work with you around specific courses and talk about strategies. But if you come in later, in the semester, obviously we're gonna ask you, what feels most important. What are you really focused on? And it could be, before an exam. It could be as you're preparing for a writing assignment, or it could be just after you've kind of received feedback and maybe gotten a score and you're kind of rethinking things. So there's really no bad time to meet with a learning specialist. We're always happy to support you. But just keep in mind that, this is just one of the academic support services that's available to you at Penn. So if you're an undergraduate, meeting with a learning specialist to do some planning and time management discussion is great. But maybe you also want to go to the Marks Center for Excellence in Writing to meet with a peer writing tutor. So that's a great resource that you can use. If you're a graduate student, the Weingarten Center is happy to work with you on your academic writing, so we can do that as well, provide some support. Our learning specialists are not content experts, so we're not able to kind of step in place of your faculty, and often we'll say, let's look at the course materials and get clarity on this, or have you spoken with your faculty member to get some feedback? But we are happy to kind of, again, talk about the process of how you're learning, and do some bigger picture stuff, but also help you with your writing, as long as we can do so without being like a content expert. The other set of academic support services that's available to undergraduate students, so this is not available through the Weingarten Center to graduate students, but to undergraduate students, is our tutoring services. So The Weingarten Center hires over 350 peer tutors every year, and works to connect students with their peers as tutors. And this either happens through weekly small group tutoring. So maybe you're meeting about chemistry, a chemistry course, or an economics course, or a philosophy course. Or we have a drop-in model. So for calculus and chemistry courses, we have drop-in tutoring available Sunday through Thursday evenings from 7:30 to 10:30 p.m. in the Houston marketplace. So that's like downstairs in Houston Hall where the kind of food area is. So a lot of different ways for undergraduates to access tutoring services. For disability services, this is a service that's available to all Penn students. Any student who identifies with a disability should connect with the Weingarten Center to ensure that they have equal access to their Penn experience. So disability services will review documentation and determine reasonable accommodations. They could be academic accommodations. They could be something related to housing, transportation, or dining. They collaborate with students, faculty, and other campus partners to implement those accommodations, and they advocate for students with disabilities. So again, you can kind of see the range of accommodation types, again, to make sure that there's an equal playing field and that all students have full access to their Penn experience. And if you are a student who isn't sure if you would qualify or have a disability, but you'd like to get more information, or if you're a student who has gone through a similar process at a previous institution, either way, the first step is to submit an accessibility request through the Weingarten Center website. And then in the process, that'll ask you two questions. So one is, what is the nature of the disability? And there's a drop-down list. One option is to say, I don't know. So if you're just, kind of want to have a conversation and you're just exploring this, that is an option. The second question is open-ended and says, what kind of accommodations do you think you might need? Or you can describe that. Again, if you don't know, you can just put that in. There will be an opportunity to submit documentation, related to the disability. It could be from a provider. It could be based on some kind of psychoeducational assessment. And your disability specialist would be happy to kind of talk to you about that if you, aren't sure about the documentation part. And then as soon as the accessibility request is submitted, students will have an initial appointment with their assigned disability specialist, can talk about accommodations. And then once that accommodation is approved, the disability specialist will make sure that the students, know the next steps in terms of accessing accommodations each semester and for specific courses. I think we're not gonna do the think, pair, share here, but again, I want you to sort of reflect for a moment. What are your best strategies for academic success? So when we meet with students, we always encourage them to think about, what works well for you, because everybody, if you're here, if you're at Penn, if you're in your program, if you're, in the college or you're somewhere else, Morton or engineering or nursing, you have been successful academically. That means you have really solid strategies that have gotten you to this point. But, you also are maybe encountering some new challenges, some new kind of course material that's less familiar. And so adapting those strategies is important, but we want to build from the good strategies that you already have. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of strategies that we often talk about in our learning consultations. So the first is about time management. So this is a phrase that people associate with the Weingarten Center. It's something people often say, I'm not good at time management, or I really need to work on my time management. But a lot of times people just think that means I just need a calendar or a schedule. And really at the Weingarten Center, we think of time management as a complete system. So in addition to having maybe a calendar that you can use and access regularly, we need to think about how are you managing tasks? How are you sort of forecasting or planning ahead? How are you allowing for some flexibility, because real life doesn't often follow the schedules that we set? Are you creating opportunities to kind of review, how did that go? What do I need to do now? And then I really wanted to highlight here accountability and support. So part of your system should be at some point relying on other people for external accountability and support, because if we just try to do it completely on our own, often we're not as effective. So the first step I always ask students to do is get everything out of your head. So this is the task management part. So if you are the kind of person who's just like, yeah, I just kind of keep things in my head. I have met a few of them. I'm impressed, but I also am concerned, and I want you to think about how can you identify those tasks and get them into some kind of system. So for some people, it's just a to-do list, which is great. Other people will use something like Google Tasks or To Do if you're an Outlook user. And these are just also kind of like, they're essentially like electronic or digital to-do lists. But a few things that I'll just say about them. So one, if you're a to-do list maker, a really common practice is for people to just make like an enormous to-do list. Here are all the things I have to do. And whenever you sit down and look at it, you just feel completely overwhelmed. And you might start the day with 50 things on your list and you end the day with 52 things on your list. So there's not really a sense of like accomplishment. So I really recommend having somewhere where you're capturing all your tasks, but I would say that maybe think about categorizing them. So maybe you have 5 or 6 to-do lists, one for each course, one for personal, life and tasks, maybe for career development, something else. So that whenever something comes up, a task comes to mind, you can put it in a categorized to-do list. And then I really like the idea of having a today list. And so the list for today, you look over everything on your categorized list, and then you just pull in maybe 4 or 5 things that you can realistically get done today that are your priority, and you focus on those. And looking at a list that's only 4 or 5 things is certainly less overwhelming than something with 50. So the To-Do app in Outlook has this option. So they have a today list, and it's always blank at the start of every day, and you have to repopulate it with the things you want to do today. If you're using Google Tasks, you can kind of accomplish the same thing by using the star function. So you can go through your categorized list and then star certain things, and then those will show up on the starred list, and that could be your like today list essentially, which I think is helpful. The other piece that I think is really important, I'll go back really fast to my a couple things, 2 other concepts. So one is we often make our projects or tasks too big, and we need to break them down into more manageable chunks. So if you have anything on your to-do list that will take you more than an hour to complete, I think it's not one task. It's probably like there's probably something you could break down further. So anything that shows up on your to-do list should be something you could finish in 20 to 60 minutes. If it's not that small, you should break it down into 2 or 3 tasks. So that's one thing. The other piece is I really like the idea of scheduling sort of shifts or study blocks, defined amounts of time that you're going to work on a task. So often students will say, oh, I have Saturday open, so I'll just work or study all day on Saturday. And usually that's wildly unproductive. You're not feeling a sense of urgency at the beginning of the day, and so you're not moving, kind of effectively through the sort of tasks. So instead of that, maybe you can set up 2 shifts. Maybe there's a 2-hour block in the morning, an hour-and-a-half block in the afternoon. And what you can do is if you're using Google Calendar, you can do this with To Do and Outlook as well. And you have your tasks sort of assigned, then you could create your study blocks and then drag in here's what I'm going to do for each of these blocks. I think it's much more effective for productivity purposes if you sit down for your study block and you already know what you're going to work on. If you sit down and you're like, oh, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, you often feel overwhelmed, and that can lead to procrastination. So I think getting in the habit at the end of each study block of taking 5 minutes to set up what are the tasks for my next study block can really ensure that you sort of stay productive from task to task. So there are a couple of resources on the Weingarten Center website. If you go under academic support and then study tools and strategies, you'll find PDF versions of our undergraduate and graduate semester planning calendars. It's just a helpful sort of fillable PDF where you can sort of see the entire spring semester on one screen, and you can sort of like map out, your major assignments and exams. The long-term exam and project planning sheet is also really helpful because, again, this is where, oh, I have to write a paper, but that's not something I should write on my to-do list, write paper or study for exam. you want to break that down into smaller tasks. So this is a sheet you could use for a large assignment or a big exam to say, what are the steps or tasks I need to complete in order to finish this assignment or to be prepared for the exam. And I think as you're thinking about the spring semester and adjustments you might make, I think it could be really helpful to think about, how are you kind of activating your learning? So what are you doing before class? What are you doing during class? And what are you doing after class? There should be, for every kind of class session, this kind of before, during, after sequence. But I would say that a lot of students think that means an hour or 2 hours of prep, doing something in class, and at least an hour or 2 hours afterwards. That's not necessarily the case. For the before class activity, maybe it's just 10 minutes, but just something where you look over notes. If you have access to the slides for the lecture ahead of time, you can glance over those. Maybe you have reading assigned, you either do the reading or at least preview the reading, looking for major themes or arguments or the structure of the reading, but just something to kind of activate your learning so that when you go into class, especially if it's a lecture, you're not kind of encountering the material cold. It's something you've heard about before, you've kind of been exposed to. During class, I think remaining as active as possible is really important. Often I have students kind of engage me in this debate, which is a good debate to have. Should I take notes during lecture or not? Should I take notes during a class discussion or not? I think it really depends. So if there is information that's being shared in the class that you can't access elsewhere, so maybe the professor is providing their own analysis or elaborating on their slides, then you probably want to be taking notes to kind of capture that information. But on the other hand, if you are writing notes, furiously, throughout the lecture, sometimes that can really kind of become an obstacle to your own comprehension. So maybe you take, really extensive notes during class, but then if after class someone said, "Oh, what happened in that class? What was that lecture about?" And if you have a hard time sort of saying, "Oh, well, this is what it was about," it could be because you were so focused on note taking. So I think in some cases it's helpful to kind of sit back and process the information that's being shared, particularly if it's, you can access most of the information through other means at a later date. But you could think about, maybe the guidance isn't to write nothing, but instead maybe you just want to write down, by the end of the class, I'm going to write down 3 questions that I could go up to the professor after lecture or during office hours to ask them. So this is a helpful way to kind of make sure that you are engaged and you are sort of thinking and processing without sort of just sitting there passively. And then after class, I'll talk a little bit more about some strategies for ensuring that you are activating your learning after class. But I do want to talk a little bit about defeating procrastination, because I think whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, procrastination is it's a pervasive challenge. Everybody has this challenge. And a few of the things on this slide we've already talked about. So identifying tasks you can conquer. Again, a task for your to-do list should be 20 to 60 minutes, no more. But sometimes it's really helpful to think about setting up a minimum task if it's something you're kind of avoiding. So if I have to work all day or be in class all day, and then I'm not sitting down to do something really difficult until later this evening, it can be really helpful for me to just have a minimum task. So at minimum, I'm going to read the abstracts for these 3 papers, or at minimum, I'm going to write 6 bullet points of what I learned in class today. Or at minimum, I'm going to read the assignment description. So just set a minimum task so that you can definitely do that. And then hopefully that kind of gets you over the obstacle of getting started, which is what procrastination is usually about, is avoiding getting started. And you'll kind of just get into it and maybe kind of sort of flow from there, where you're just not avoiding starting, but you're just kind of doing it. We talked about placing limits in your study and work time. I think it's really important. Some people like to have some strategies, a few strategies that help them get started. So one is just simple, like a timer. Hitting start on the timer is a great way to sort of feel oh, I'm starting. Other people do things like they write down affirmations. Here's 3 things, positive things I can say about myself right now. And that feels sort of good, and that helps you kind of get started. Other people might stand up and do 10 jumping jacks and then sit down and get started. So it's good to have these as kind of stackable strategies, because a strategy might not work. It might work well one day, but not work the next day. So having a few strategies for getting started can be useful. And then some people really do like using timers. So if you, again, sort of adopt this study block method, a study block being an hour and a half to 2 hours, then that's great. And then within that, some people like using the Pomodoro method. So maybe your study block is an hour and a half. So a Pomodoro is a 25-minute concentration circuit. So if I am going to study for an hour and a half, that means I can do 3 circuits or 3 Pomodoros. And so I'm going to hit start on my timer for 25 minutes, do a focused work session, take a 5-minute break, stand up, get a drink of water, get some tea, sit down, do another 25 minutes. Hitting start kind of moves you into the work. And then, sometimes when your energy and attention sort of lag, you might look at the timer and see, oh, I have 8 more minutes. It can sort of like pull me through to the end. And then park on a downhill slope. This is what I was talking about with, if you adopt my study block method, at the end of the block, you set up the next session. So if you're writing a paper, a really great thing to do is, often we feel satisfied when we get to the end of a paragraph or a section. We're like, bam, I did it. But then it can be really hard to start the next paragraph when you sit down the next time. So you can be really nice to your future self by writing like a crappy version of the next paragraph, or maybe just some bullet points. Like, here's what I could say. Or you could write it in like really casual language. I have to really argue that this makes more sense than that because this and this and this, so just something really kind of casual and quick, because when you sit down in the next session and you sort of see that, you'll be like, okay, I remember what I was thinking. Okay, I can kind of develop this further, as opposed to just like, oh, I'm just starting with nothing. And then again, I mentioned this with an effective time management system, creating external accountability. So telling a friend or family member what you're planning to do is incredibly effective. I used to say to my partner when I was writing my dissertation, I'm going to write 1 page tonight. And she would say, I don't really care. And I'd say, okay, but I said it. So now I feel like accountable to sort of follow through on that. The other thing that people do that I think is really great, especially when it's cold and dark in Philadelphia, is they'll do like co-working. So co-working is great if you can go to the library with somebody or another study space. But, in the winter, maybe it's hard to kind of get out of your space, get out of your apartment or your dorm or wherever you are. So we found it really helpful when students would schedule Zoom sessions with each other. You turn on your camera, your microphone at the beginning. You both say, this is what I want to do during this co-working session. These are my goals. Then you turn off your mic. You can turn off your camera too, and just work for 45 minutes or an hour. Turn them back on once the timer goes off and say, how did that go? What do you need to do the next time? Just a really effective intervention where we can kind of hold each other accountable and support each other as we're doing hard things. I'm going to touch really briefly on, again, kind of thinking about active learning strategies, but specifically for exam preparation. So if you have a big exam or a series of exams this semester, it is common for students to think, well, I should do a comprehensive review. I should go back to the beginning, look at all the slide decks for all the lectures, and then maybe at the end I'll practice. But I don't like that method, obviously, this big red X. So I like the idea of using our long-term exam planning sheet to break down what are the steps I want to complete to be prepared for this exam. So that's the planning part. But then some kind of self-assessment at the beginning. So maybe you have access to a practice exam that you could take. Maybe you can quiz your friend can quiz you. And I'll show you one other method of self-assessment. But starting with like, what do I know right now? And then doing strategic review based on that. Because if you just kind of passively read through everything, it can be really ineffective because 1, it takes a really long time. 2, you create a false sense of mastery. If you're just looking at slide decks, you'll sort of say, oh yeah, I know this, I get this. But then when you go to take the exam, you're not able to access or produce that information. So you want to kind of put that on yourself as part of your study process. What do I know right now? Okay, now I need to review based on these gaps in my knowledge, do some practice, and then let me test it again. So if you can kind of create this cycle in your exam preparation, it can be much more effective. I would say for most courses, the process of concept mapping can be very helpful. And it's very simple. So these researchers are cognitive psychologists. They talked about how, rereading things can be very passive and ineffective. What they really encourage people to do is something called active retrieval. So can you reach back and pull information forward as frequently as possible? And, taking a practice exam is one way, studying with somebody else and having them test you is another way. But then this other way is very simple, but I like it a lot. Find a whiteboard or a piece of paper, and maybe it's just for this week's lecture. I'm not going to look at any notes. I'm not going to look at any slides. What do I remember? Let me write down everything I can remember and draw things out. Just anything I can kind of produce. Students are really reluctant to do this, but what they find is that there's kind of a snowball effect. They start writing one thing and they're like, oh yeah, we did talk about this. And you're able to sort of show yourself that even if you just got exposed to the material for the first time in the lecture, you're able to kind of reproduce more than you thought, which is helpful. But then there will also be gaps. And again, you go back and fill in those gaps by doing that kind of strategic review. So I have some students who really adopted this method, and for every study block, they would start with this. What can I just remember on my own? Now let me do some strategic review. Let me try it again. And the thing is, you can kind of zoom in or pan out. You could look at something really specific in a course. You could kind of look at the whole course overall. It can also be a helpful practice if you're kind of lost in writing a paper. You sort of feel like you've lost the argument, or you're not sure how you're structuring things. Just kind of start from scratch with a whiteboard and see what you can get down. It's really helpful to kind of get refocused. And then so just more broadly, I think if you're thinking about the spring semester, think about your learning community. So what are the sources of support? So learning consultations at the Weingarten Center, we hope is one. Office hours, if you haven't used those, I would say it's great to break the seal early on office hours, meaning go soon. Because if you go soon, then even just to introduce yourself, or to say, oh, I'm interested in this class because, then you've made that initial connection, and you're much more likely to come back and use that service again, to connect with that professor again. Whereas if you just wait until 3/4 of the way into the semester, you're going to feel like, oh, well, now if I go, there's like a lot of pressure. I have to say something really smart, have a really good question. So do it early so that you're more likely to access that again. But of course, peers, study groups, these are really helpful things to kind of build into your learning community. And I'm a huge fan of study groups. So if you're a person who says, well, study groups never work for me, I'm not a fan, think about connecting with one other person, maybe really have a conversation. How do we want to structure this? What could be effective for us? And I think that would be really helpful. So again, I'm just going to wrap up before we do some Q&A to say, go to the Weingarten Center website. You'll see in the top right corner, there's a maroon box that says My Weingarten Center. That's our portal. So you can go in there and schedule a learning consultation with one of our specialists. It's also where if you want to access disability services, you could start that accessibility request. And there's more information on our website about accessing tutoring services. So Mike, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I'll see if any folks have questions. Feel free to put them into the Q&A. Happy to, even if it's not quite a question, it's just a comment or something you want to share, really happy to respond there. So I'll wait for those, but maybe for the recording purpose, I'll say thank you again for listening today. The Weingarten Center, we're always happy to work with students. We really hope you reach out and connect with us. Thanks a lot.